My name is Christina Jenks. I'm a technical support engineer at Qlik, and I'm going to go ahead and close this message. And my main focus is integrations. I've been at Qlik for nearly 1.5 years, and today we're going to talk about the APIs. So this is our agenda. The first thing we're going to briefly cover is just general information about contacting support with API-related issues, what is supported, and how generally to approach API issues. And then we're going to do several demonstrations today, which make up the bulk of our presentation. I'm going to demonstrate the QlikSense QRS API, which is used to access the repository service, getting apps, for instance. I'm going to show how to authenticate with certificate authentication and also virtual proxy authentication. And I'll be using a couple of different tools. I'll be using Postman as well as Powershell. We'll also be doing a demonstration with the NPrinting API, demonstrating how to connect there in the same tools. Now, a quick note about the tools we're using for our presentation. I am using the latest release of Postman. If you are having issues setting cookies, please update from 6.1.3 to 6.1.4. And do bear in mind that NTLM is in beta in Postman Desktop. Overall, Postman is a great tool, but it does need to be installed. On the other hand, PowerShell ships with Windows, which is why we're showing equivalent examples in PowerShell. You can just copy-paste these scripts directly into your server. So let's talk about working with technical support. So what is generally supported? There's two kind of criteria that come into this. The first is that the API really should be publicly documented on help.qlik.com. If using an API and it's not publicly documented, you should probably assume that it is a private API or an internal API, and generally that's not going to be supported. The other aspect to this, and this is really more for technical reasons, is can you replicate the issue outside your custom code? We do have consulting and pre-sales available that can help you with code review or projects if you want to get involved with them. But this is really more important for just a problem-solving perspective. So let's talk about how to solve API-related issues. The first step is, of course, to describe the issue. And often by adequately describing the issue, we have a resource called the knowledge base that was covered in a previous session that documents many known issues. And if worst case scenario you can't find the issue in the knowledge base, the next step is to build a good test case in good conditions. So what do I mean when I say describe the issue? I'm talking about something like this. When I do X and Y conditions, then Z should happen. But what actually happens is something else. For instance, when I make a GET request to my server at port 4242/QRS/about from my custom app on a separate server, then the API should return information about QlikSense. And what actually happens is I get this error, XSRF prevention check failed, possible XSRF discovered. Now, if you've written out the problem and statement in this way, you probably are going to be able to resolve it on your own because this particular error is well documented. It's just a simple misuse of the API. This header and this URL parameter with the QRS API is required for cross-script prevention. We have a prior support TechSport Thursday segments talks about how to use the knowledge base called Resolving Your Qlik Issues 101. So I won't go into details on how to use the knowledge base, but if you want to learn more, I recommend viewing that segment. But let's say that you have checked the knowledge base and you've thoroughly written out a description of the problem. The next thing we want to do is replicate in good conditions. And what I mean by this is locally on the server using recognized ways of testing. So for instance, if you're having an issue with the REST API, using a REST client such as PowerShell or Postman. If you're having an issue with the Engine API, using the Engine API Explorer in the Dev Hub. This is a tool that is known to work and is used to connect to the API of the engine. Or if you're having an issue with an extension or a mashup, putting together a JavaScript test case to isolate the API and demonstrate what is not working. So if we look at the previous description of our issue, you may have noticed part of the statement included my custom app on a separate server. So what we have are three separate factors that are kind of making it difficult to narrow down what the issue is. We have a custom application, so we have custom code. We don't know if there's simply a syntax error or just an issue at the order in which things are called. We also don't know if there is a network issue. This is on a separate server, so there could be something in between the client making the call and the server responding to the call that is causing problems. So by replicating in good conditions locally on the server using recognized ways of testing, we help to eliminate those two factors. And this helps us to basically get to a point where we can replicate any API issue if it is confirmed and bring it to R&D for resolution. What we're going to be focusing on in particular are with REST API testing, Powershell and Postman. So let's get right into our demonstrations. We're first going to talk about connecting to the Qlik repository API. There's two different ways of connecting to the API. One is using certificates, and this is when you're connecting on your server at port 4242. The other is via the virtual proxy. This is when you're connecting to your server via the virtual proxy, or if you don't connect to a specific virtual proxy, connecting to the default virtual proxy. The general use case for certificate-based authentication is when you're doing stuff in the backend, when you're behind the network and you can access the server directly on port 4242 and use certificates. If you're connecting via the front end, then you might use virtual proxy and use cookies for sessions. So let's demonstrate how to connect via certificates in Postman. So I pulled up Postman here on my machine. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm doing this on a separate machine just so that I can mess around with the certificates in this particular case. So if I go ahead and try and make this call here in Postman desktop, it'll say 403 no client certificate supplied. One thing that's different about Postman desktop versus the Chrome app, which has been deprecated, is that you need to specify the certificates manually. So what I need to do in this case is go to settings and add those certificates. I'm making the call to qlikserver1.domain.local at port 4242. And then I'm going to include my certificates. Now for these, what I've done is I've gone to the QMC and I've exported my certificates in the PEM format. And then what I've done is I've taken out the client PEM and the client key PEM, just dropped them into a separate folder and really just renamed them to a CRT and a .key file. So now that I've specified this, it should go through just fine. But there's another part of this as well. So there's a couple of other things that are happening when I'm connecting. I'll go ahead and take these out and show you what happens. So I've supplied my certificate, but now it's going to say 403 forbidden. And here's that common error that we talked about earlier. So I need to include an XSRF key. I have the XRF key up here in the URL. I also need to include a header called x-qlik-xrf key. It just needs to be a 16-digit random string to prevent cross-site scripting. Now, if I make this call, I'm not exactly telling the API what user to authenticate as. So I need to specify that as well in the header with xqlik user, specify my user directory and my user domain. And this is basically what I need to connect via certificates in Postman. Now let's talk about how to connect via certificates in PowerShell. PowerShell is a little bit different. It's a bit more strict on certificates. I basically am just going to pull them from the certificate store on the machine. And as a best practice, I should specify the TLS version. I don't necessarily need to do this for the Qlik API, but we'll talk more on this later when we talk about NPrinting. And I'll show you some errors you might run across with certificates. I just have a couple of examples sitting here. So in this particular example here, I'm just doing the same thing as I did in Postman. I'm providing the appropriate headers, the XRF key, and the user. I'm getting my certificates from my certificate store on the machine. I'm just looking for something called Qlik client, which if you pull up the MMC and look for your personal certificates or the machine certificates in this case, I have them installed personal so I can remove them and break them for this demonstration. I'm looking for basically this certificate here. And then I'm just making my API call with invoke REST method. So I'm going to go ahead and open PowerShell, paste this in here, and I get the same response as I did in Postman. Now, something I might run across is issues with SSL with certificate trust. There's ways to get around this. There are ways to do this in PowerShell that I won't show for copyright reasons, but you can basically override some objects to force it to always ignore certificate errors. What I'm going to show is how to mess with this and fix this in the MMC with just the trust. So I'm going to force an error by removing the certificate authority root certificate. Let's go ahead and delete this. Don't worry, I already have a backup of this over here on desktop. Actually, I'll need to quick take a backup of this. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close this session and reopen it. So now if I try to invoke this, it's going to say the underlying connection was closed, cannot establish trust relationship. So what I need to do is basically go back in and add that root certificate again. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and open up a separate machine and show you where to get that. So what I've basically done is I've gone to certificates. I've added the machine name of the certificate I want to make the call from. I've included the secret key and exported in Windows format. When I export this, it's going to give me a message saying where it has put it, but it's going to be in C, program data, Qlik, sense, repository, exported certificates. My certificates are over here. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the root certificate. And again, I'm just installing this under my current user since I'm breaking this for demonstration purposes. Yes, I trust the certificates. So now if I look back at my certificate again, we can see that it has a proper certification path. And if I go ahead and make this call in a new session, it'll go through just fine. Okay, so let's get back to a presentation here. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm just doing this by messing with the certification path in the MMC. And again, you can implement any number of PowerShell overrides if you're dealing with certificates. So let's get to talking about connecting to Postman. Basically, with Postman, you're going to be connecting on a very specific endpoint. So whereas with the QRS API, I can basically go to /about and I can connect there. Oh wait, sorry. I got out of order here. Sorry, we're going to talk about connecting via virtual proxy in Postman. So connecting via virtual proxy is going to basically be when you're going to the virtual proxy you've configured in the QMC. So that could be configured with Windows authentication, it could be header authentication, JWT, SAML, etc. And in this case, I'm going to be demonstrating with Windows authentication. So when connecting in Postman, there's just a couple things to keep in mind. You need to remember to use the user agent Windows header. It will serve HTML if you don't, because it expects forms authentication if you don't specify that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, again, NTLM is in beta. In April 2018 and higher, we changed the redirect for NTLM authentication, and Postman didn't like this. So I'm going to show you how to work around with that. So let's go ahead and go back to our virtual machine. So here's my window. I'm going to go ahead and make sure all my cookies are cleared because I want to make sure that I show you this. So if I try to make a request, it's going to say could not get any response. Now, normally this would mean that if I go to my settings, the SSL certificate verification is turned on, but in this case, we know it's turned off. What's actually going on is it just doesn't know how to follow the redirect quite correctly. So what I'm going to do is turn that off, make my GET request, and I'm going to manually get the new header, copy that, and I'm going to turn the automatic following of redirects back on. Go ahead and make that request, and now I've successfully gone through and authenticated, and I know it works because I've got a cookie. I'm going to go ahead and just Control-Z back to my previous request. So now that I have a cookie, which I can see here as well as if I scroll up, I can see here in my cookies for my session for my Windows virtual proxy, I can now make requests. So for instance, let's say I want to get a list of my apps. I can make a GET request, and I can see License Monitor and a couple of other different kinds of apps. But let's take a look at demo. Let's say we want to take a look at this particular app, at this ID. So I'll go ahead and pull this one up and look at this particular ID, and I can get more information about this app. If I want to make a post request, I can just go ahead and make a post request, and in this case, I'm going to try and reload the app. And then if we go ahead and refresh our thing here, we can see that the last reload time was in fact just under a minute ago here. So let's go back to our presentation. Let's talk about how to do this in PowerShell. It's pretty straightforward. There's just a couple of things to keep in mind. Again, make sure to use the user agent Windows header. Otherwise, again, you'll get HTML instead. And to use the use default credentials flag when authenticating. The credential one is just basically a container for username and password. It's not actually going to invoke NTLM. And of course, you can run across the same kind of certificate issues as you would with certificate-based authentication if the certificates aren't trusted. So let's go ahead and demonstrate that. I'll go back to my machine. So as you can see, it's just pretty straightforward. I'm specifying just the XRF key like I would, and I'm specifying the user agent Windows. And then I'm just making, in this case, I'm appending the virtual proxy to my URL. And I'm using default credentials. So I'll go ahead and just make this call here. And there we go. And of course, I can run across the same kinds of issues as before. And I can really quick demonstrate here because it'd be easier to show here if I omit the user agent. There we go. Okay, now let's talk about the NPrinting APIs, since I got ahead of myself earlier. Okay, like I mentioned, so the NPrinting APIs need to basically authenticate on a very specific endpoint on port 4993. So it's not going to have the same kind of concept of certificate-based versus virtual proxy-based authentication as the QRS API. You're going to authenticate on a very specific endpoint, and you're going to need to store the session from your authentication to use that in other requests. So you definitely need to be able to use cookies, which is why I mentioned that earlier in the presentation with Postman. And another exception to this is that while you're going to need to specify the cross-site scripting key on every single request for both GET and POST requests in the QRS API, with Postman, you're going to only need to specify this for POST requests, and you're going to pull that from the XSRF cookie. So let's go ahead and make a demonstration of this with Postman. Go ahead and make sure I clear out the cookie. If I try to make a call without having authenticated first, it's going to throw an error, say 403, user has no rights to access this resource. So in this case, I don't need to do any kind of special thing. It just works with Postman. So I'm just going to use NTLM authentication and hit send on the API v1 login endpoint. And I get a 200 OK with a result and a code and a message. And I get two cookies. I get my session cookie, and my session cookie down here, and I also get my XSRF token cookie. So now I can go to the other endpoints and I can make my requests. So again, notice I have no authentication. I'm just using the cookie. And I can make a GET request to get my tasks. Here we are. I just have one as a demonstration. And then let's say I want to go ahead and start that task. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this out just to show you what happens. So if I try to call this without the XSRF token, it's going to throw a forbidden error. And it'll say Rebel CSRF tokens mismatch, which is a fun error. I'm going to go ahead and include this, and it's still going to fail because this is out of date. If I try this again, you'll see that it's still forbidden. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this value here. I can get this from a couple places. I can just pull it from the cookie here, or my personal preference is just pull it here in Postman. Just pull this value here. There we go. And now I can see that my response was accepted and it returned a JSON of the tasks saying that is in queue. Okay, so that was pretty straightforward. What about doing this with PowerShell? So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, as a best practice, you'll want to specify TLS. And if you're using February 2018 and higher in NPrinting, you definitely need to do this because TLS, the minimum used to be 1.0 and now it has been increased to 1.1. So you need to make sure that you specify the version of TLS when you're making that call in PowerShell. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. First thing I'm doing is I'm specifying the TLS version here. I'm just specifying the later one, 1.2. And then the next thing I'm doing is I'm going ahead and authenticating at that specific endpoint, API v1 login NTLM with default credentials again. So I'm using the credentials of the user invoking the script. And then I'm getting all this stuff down here is getting the cookie from the session and storing it. And then I'm just doing some demonstrative stuff down here. I'm getting a list of tasks and NPrinting, and I'm just picking an arbitrary task and executing it. So let's go ahead and just run all this to see what happens, just to show that this will work right now. There we go. So we see that we get the result here. So I've been authenticated, and then if I go ahead and press enter, there we go. That again, I've gone ahead and started this task. So let's see what happens when things go wrong. So let's say we don't specify the security protocol, the TLS protocol. So we're going to get a message like this: request is aborted, cannot create SSL TLS secure channel. So what I need to do again is I need to specify the version of TLS when I'm making the request, and that'll work out just fine. There we go. Now there are a few other things that can happen related to certificates. In this particular case, I haven't done anything in PowerShell to tell it to ignore SSL related errors. I've just added the certificate so that it's trusted. So if I go ahead and close this window, I'll show you. If I go to the NPrinting dashboard, you notice that it trusts this. And if I look at the security report, it says that it identifies and trusts it. I can break this, and then I will get SSL error. So I'll show you that. I'm going to go to my trusted root certificate authorities, locate the one that has my NPrinting server on it. So in this case, it's Qlik server 3. I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. Okay, so that one's gone. So if I try to make this call again, I'm going to do everything right, but I don't trust the connection. I'm not doing anything special to override it. In fact, actually, I'll just do this part up here. Just going to authenticate. There. Underlying connection was closed. Could not establish trust relationship for the SSL TLS secure channel. So the way I'm going to get around this is I'm just going to actually go straight to the NPrinting dashboard and just install the certificate from here. So you notice now that I've removed that certificate, it doesn't trust it in the browser either. So I'll go ahead and just continue to the website, and I'll just go to the certificate View Certificates in Internet Explorer, and click Install Certificate. It's a bit more convoluted with other browsers. I'm just showing it with Internet Explorer because it's super easy to do it this way. Okay, yes, I trust the certificates, and the import was successful. So I'll go ahead and close the browser and reopen it. We should see that it's trusted, and it is. And if I go ahead and close this instance of PowerShell and open up a new one, make sure I've got this on my clipboard, we'll see that this goes through just fine. All right, so we've covered the 2 demonstrations for today. So here are some final takeaways. Again, coming back to describing and approaching API issues, the first step is to adequately describe the issue, really make clear essentially what kind of environment this is in, all the things that this touches. And, of course, clearly describe what the error is. And often by doing this, clearly describing the error in particular, you usually can find a known solution in the knowledge base quite easily without having to reach out to support. And a worst case scenario, you still can't figure it out. You can raise the support case and build a test case in good conditions, which is what we demonstrated today with the PowerShell and the Postman tools. So again, reminder that the knowledge base is a great resource, and we have a prior segment on this. And all of the demonstrations I've made today are actually available in articles. I actually wrote a couple of these as part of preparing for this presentation to fill in some of these knowledge gaps. So you can find all of these. This is just a sampling of them. There's more. You can find all of this on the knowledge base. So some final just general API testing information and tips. For Qlik Sense, generally I find it's easier to test certificate-based authentication with PowerShell just because I can pull it from the certificate store. Postman's pretty straightforward too. You just need to manually specify what certificate you want to point it at. And of course, remember with the QRS API that you need to do the XRF key check that is needed on all requests. And for NPrinting, it's usually easier to test in Postman just because it can automatically store cookies and use them across requests, whereas as you saw with the PowerShell example, I need to save this cookie and store it in a session and do a bunch of stuff in PowerShell to make this work. But of course, it has its own quirks. You don't need to include this XRF key check on every single request, just post request, and you're going to get that information from the cookie.
Okay, so there's already a couple questions in the Q&A, but now's your time to enter the ones you've been thinking of, and we'll see how many we can address.
Best practice for splitting the certificates and private key when exporting certificates. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by best practice. When I'm exporting the certificates, I'm using the ones I used. I was using the self-signed certificates. I haven't added any third-party thumbprints, any third-party certificates to the proxy, so I'm just using the ones that Qlik Sense comes with. So if I pull up my machine here, so this is a fun thing here. So if I'm doing the platform independent format, including secret key doesn't make any difference. It's going to include that no matter what. So I think test 2 was where I did that just to test it out. Yeah, it's going to include client PM, client key, root, server, server key. Whereas the secret key will be applied if you're doing the Windows format. I hope that answers your question. Oh, yeah. Is there an API call which will notify us that the app is reloaded? Yeah, I think I might have showed that. It might have just been missed. It's just the app endpoint. So if I go to the machine back here, I'll just go ahead and I already have a cookie. I'll just use this one. Oh wait, that's the wrong one. Here we are. It would be the just the app endpoint. I can see it from here. I think. Okay, no. Okay, I need to go specifically to the app ID. So I'm going to go to the app endpoint. I'm going to get my app ID, and I'm just going to go to QRS/app/app ID. If I scroll down here, last reload time will tell me when the app was last reloaded. So let's see, I think I might have killed my cookie when I did this. Yeah, I killed it. Let's go ahead and fix that again. But it's going to be the same endpoint. So it's going to be /app/this. I'm just going to quick fix this so I can show you the reload again. Again, I'm going to turn off automatic following of redirects. Let's go back to where I authenticate. Get, go to location, copy this. I'm going to quick turn on the following of redirects again. Get my cookie. Okay, so now we're in business again. So let's get this app. Okay, so we can see the last reload time here was 1421. So if I go ahead and go to app/reload, I'm going to get a 204, no content. And then if I refresh this, we should see that it was updated. And here we are. It's 1438, and we can see that it was last reloaded at 1438. Yes, my Postman client and my server are all under the same domain. And I'm just using simple Windows authentication in this example. And I just wanted to do that in particular because it seemed relatively common. And I ran across some strange stuff with Postman that I wanted to show how to work around. Okay, this I think is a good question. How can you build a test case for testing the engine API? This is a fun one. So I'll quick show you the Dev Hub. Let's go to Qlik server 1. So in the Dev Hub, we have something called the Engine API Explorer. It's over here somewhere. Here we are, Engine API Explorer. So this is basically what we try to use when we're trying to verify stuff with the engine. There is in rare cases, there is a JavaScript API called Enigma. It's an open source bit, but what we want to usually do first is just get a list of steps with how to connect via the engine API because it is sequential. So I need to first connect to the engine, select an app. I don't think I have very much in this app, but now I've connected to the app and you can see that I have these logs down here. I think I can make this bigger, maybe not. And then I can basically like pick a method in here. So I don't know, maybe let's see, something I did recently. Maybe, I don't think get objects is going to do anything. I'll click execute and see what happens. Yeah, no, I was thinking of something else. Let's find something more exciting that has some information in it. I think it's to get all infos. There it is, get all infos. Let's execute that one. So you'll see this gets executed down here and we get the request and the response, etc. So when we talk about creating like a test case with the engine API, ideally what we'd want to have is a list of steps. Okay, I call this first, then I call this, because I'm going to get discoverable objects. So if I pick like maybe a table, for instance, I can get that object and I can do additional stuff on that object. And I can keep doing this and chaining these together with these handles here. So when we talk about building a test case with the engine API, what we want to have is, an exact description of, what calls you're making and the order that you're making them. And in, if it's, if in exceptional circumstances you're doing some crazy stuff with the API, it would be okay if you build a test case and you're using something like using something like the Enigma JavaScript API just to demonstrate the issue. But that's generally what we mean when we try to say build a test case with the engine API using the engine API Explorer. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you to Christina for presenting. We always appreciate getting experts like Christina to share with us. We've got a legal disclaimer for you. Thank you once again, and have a great rest of your day.